All right, welcome everyone. My name is Greg Godowski. Today we're going to talk a lot about what engineers can do to incorporate risk analysis into their design. It really doesn't matter what discipline you work within. Many of the products that we build, from bridges to planes to automobiles, to even medical devices like the one shown here, which is a Da Vinci robot for doing uh, GI surgery. There's risk associated with that. And so, how does an engineer go about evaluating risk and trying to incorporate design elements that help mitigate and minimize the risk? This is particularly important in the area of medical devices because we all rely on those devices to sometimes save our life. And so the FDA has the Food and Drug Administration, that is, has essentially created a process that all manufacturers must adhere to when building a medical device. And as part of that process, they have had to incorporate a risk analysis. And so I'm going to talk about the risk analysis in the context of medical device design, but all of the things that I'm about to present could be equally applied to any area of engineering where risk is an important factor. So let's move ahead, and I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics and the standards that have been developed for the medical device industry. All right, well, as I said, it doesn't really matter whether you're building a medical device or not, but one of the primary tasks of an engineering manager is to figure out how to manage the team and prioritize their efforts so that they're not developing, a product for 25 years. And so the FDA has come up with a system for guiding the design team so that they can prioritize and focus their resources really on the highest components that have risk associated with them. And this has been referred to as a preliminary hazard analysis. And so let's just do a little bit of a dive into, what that involves. And so, as you might imagine, it begins with the identification of risk. And, so you're going to have to think about how someone's going to utilize your project, your product, and identify the risks in using it. And you're going to have to evaluate how significant those risks might be. It results on a cut in the finger, for example. Now, if the risks are sufficiently high, you're going to have to decide whether your team should come up with design elements that mitigate the risk. And what this figure illustrates is that it's not a once and done type of deal. It's going to be cyclical. So you may build a device, incorporate something on the device to mitigate a risk. Then you're going to have to reevaluate it to see if it in fact worked. And you'll go around and around this loop until the product and all of the risks associated with utilizing the product have been mitigated to a level at which the company is satisfied that there's little risk in utilizing the device, or an acceptable amount of risk in utilizing the device. Now, the guidance document for this is referred to as the ISO 14971 document. It's been revised for several years now. The last revision was in 2019. It's maintained by an organization, a society called AAMI. The title of that document is Medical Devices, the Application of Risk Management to Medical Devices. And this is the document that the FDA really kind of looks for you to kind of utilize in creating a risk management program at your company. Before we do a deep dive into that document, let's review some standard definitions. So right now I'm showing you a slide of a kayaker and a shark. Now, if you were to look at this picture, in terms of risk analysis, the shark represents a hazard. So anything, any object, anything that poses a risk is referred to as a hazard. Now, the way the risk analysis works is you look at the situation, the hazardous situation. Is the shark in close proximity to the kayaker in this case? And then you have to evaluate what potential harm could come to the kayaker should a situation occur. Now, I'm going to show you some statistics, and I think the statistics must come from California, but here are some statistics on kayaking as a function of state, whether you're in California, Florida, or Hawaii. And so they compare the occurrence of shark attacks and shark deaths to that of lightning deaths. And so what you see is if you're in Hawaii, the likelihood of you getting struck by lightning is almost zero. But there have been 6 deaths due to sharks in Hawaii between 1959 and 2004. Whereas if you like to kayak in, let's say, California, maybe it's perhaps a little safer because the lightning deaths there are a little higher, with 26 over that same period of time. But the number of shark deaths has only been 5, and the shark attacks is actually lower in comparison to Florida. So if you want to kayak, don't go to Florida, but maybe go to California or Hawaii as an example. But, in reality, there are lots of different situations which can impact these statistics. So here I'm going to show you a very quick clip from a scenario that I'm very familiar with in Rhode Island. And so watch this for 5 seconds, and then we'll talk about it in a moment. Well, so my parents live in Rhode Island, and in fact, I'm very familiar with this scenario that many individuals will like to go tuna fishing off of kayaks off the coast of Rhode Island. And that changes the hazardous situation. If you hang a piece of tuna off this kayak, the likelihood of a shark attack is not small. It's actually fairly high. And in this, my dad actually has some really good friends that are very well known for doing tuna fishing off the coast. And I can tell you that in a lot of cases, they're up to 9 to 10 miles off the coast of Rhode Island. So let me put that in perspective. If you're off the coast by 9 to 10 miles, you can't see the shore. There's no swimming to the shoreline. And so my dad's friend has described these incidents with sharks as being fairly significant. And so what you find in this scenario is that you could have one hazard, the shark, but you could have many different hazardous situations that lead to potential harm. So each of these things are considered independently when evaluating the risk. So if you were going to go out in a kayak, if you weren't going to carry a tuna fishing rod, you might not worry so much. But, if you were going to go fishing, you might carry some other items in the boat that help you fend off sharks should you be dragging a 500-pound tuna behind your kayak because it won't fit in the boat and you want to bring it back to shore while it's bleeding in the water. So that is, precisely what hazard analysis is all about. It's thinking about all of the different scenarios and all of the different hazards and the potential harm that could occur in each of those scenarios. So now we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into the medical device side of things, but this sets the tone for the definitions that are within that 14971 ISO standard. All right, let's step you through one example with a very simple medical device, a scalpel blade. Now keep in mind the preliminary hazard analysis precedes the development of the device. So this is kind of a retrospective look at scalpel blades But this represents the analysis you would do before you develop the device, before it ends up on the market. So it's easy to look back, as they say, hindsight is always 20/20, but you would be doing this before the device actually got on the market. So consider a scalpel blade. The scalpel blade is like the shark. It is the hazard. Now there are many hazardous situations that scalpel blade could find itself within. For example, the surgeon is going to be utilizing the scalpel blade, to cut the patient. It's going to be in close proximity to the surgeon. The blade could break. And if the blade breaks, that could be another hazardous situation. So there are multiple hazardous situations related to the blade, but there are also multiple potential harms. And the potential harms could actually be to different individuals. So for example, if the surgeon is cutting the skin of a patient, that surgeon is exposing themselves to bloodborne diseases. So therefore they do tests now to to alert the surgeon, when they're operating on a patient that puts them at risk, especially when they're cutting the individual. Now, that scalpel blade could also, since it's in close proximity to the glove, it could puncture the glove of the surgeon. So not only does it cut the patient, but it could cut the surgeon, further exposing them to those bloodborne pathogens. Now, if the device were to break, it could have many potential harms. It could injure the person who's trying to throw it away. It could get lost in the patient. Yes, that happens. And then they have to go find it. So all of these things are things that you need to think about in advance when you're constructing even the simplest of devices, perhaps that of a scalpel blade. All right, so we're about at the 15-minute mark. We're going to take a brief break here for a quiz, and then we'll get started again in a moment. So hold on 1 second. All right, as part of the requirements for obtaining PDH credit for this seminar, we have to ask you questions related to the content. And so here are the first two questions. Question number 1. The primary standard for the application of risk management to medical devices is ISO standard XXX. You fill in the blank. You tell me what it is in the chat window, and we'll talk about it in a moment. The second question is, a manufacturer is required to establish a risk management process as part of the design of a medical device. True or false? Again, answer in the chat window and we'll talk about it briefly. Take care. All right, some of you out there I know are going to be thinking, wow, this is a lot like the risk management tools that we utilize at our company. And so how are they different? So why, what does the medical device industry do differently than some of the others? So most of you are probably familiar with an FMEA. And if you look at the ASQ site, the definition of the FMEA is really a stepwise approach for identifying all possible failures within a design. It could be within the manufacturing or assembly process. It could be a failure along the product or service line as well. And so really it's looking at component failures and what the potential outcomes will be. Well, many of the acronyms, much of the terminology is going to feel the same, but it is different. There are other tools out there that are also utilized by other industries, such as for railway safety, those developed by FRA, those for developing food products and food manufacturing. They utilize a process called hazard analysis and critical control points. Others use process hazard analysis. There are hazard and operational operability studies that are used in the gas industry. And many of us are also familiar with event tree analysis, or ETAs, that are used to evaluate a process and where it might fail, along the way in its use. But it's worth noting that the preliminary hazard analysis is fundamentally different, even though the acronyms are going to seem the same. It's fundamentally different because it considers how a device is used. The device does not have to break for there to be risk. It might be used in a way that the person didn't think it was going to be utilized. It may be used, we build devices with an intended use, but someone might use it differently. A different stakeholder might handle that device that we never considered would be handling it, maybe when it was sterilized, and it might pose a totally different risk. And so that's where it differs. It's more of a risk management plan, and trying to think out all of the different ways that harm can occur outside of and including part failures along the way down the road. So it's actually much more encompassing than some of the tools. So let's take a little bit of a deep dive into a preliminary hazard analysis. All right, so I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wow, really? That sounds like trying to predict something with a crystal ball. Really, who's ultimately responsible? And that is actually well defined in the ISO 14971 document. And it actually falls under the responsibility of the top management and CEO of a company. And it very explicitly states the following: the top management shall, 1, define and document the policy for determining the criteria for risk acceptability. This policy shall ensure that the criteria are based upon applicable national or regional regulations and relevant international standards. That means that the top person at the company must be the one that says, okay, I've had enough. I think we've developed it with our best ability to accept the amount of risk that this product will be utilized. That's a pretty important responsibility. So number 2, they shall review the suitability of the risk management process and at planned intervals to ensure continuing effectiveness of the risk management process. That means when they predict with the crystal ball, it's not done. They have to keep predicting with the crystal ball, and they have to make sure that they're managing risk as a function of time while the product is on the market. They can't just say, I looked at it 10 years ago and it didn't seem like it was a problem 10 years ago. That is not good enough. So the ISO document actually puts a lot of responsibility on the top management, because they are the ones that set the criteria for whether the amount of risk is acceptable, and they are responsible for making sure that it's continuously reviewed throughout the life cycle of the product. All right, so who does the risk analysis? And so, I guess the more proper terminology today would be, well, it's a tiger team. It is literally a tiger team. So the company will put together individuals, not just engineers, but they'll bring in nurses, they'll bring in clinicians to be on their board. They'll have nurses that are actually employed at companies. They'll bring in quality specialists. They'll bring in people from legal. They'll all have role on the risk management team, because everybody at the company can think a lot about the risk of how a device is being utilized. And so they'll have this tiger team that basically oversees the entire process at a company, and it's a real big deal. So Keep that in mind when you're looking at your own risk process. Does the CEO get account? Is he or she held accountable if a part breaks? And in some cases, that's true, but in other cases, it's not true. So, but in the medical device industry, it really kind of comes down to the top management. And so keep that in mind when you're thinking about your own risk policy at your company. All right, so what is that Tiger team going to do? All right, so remember, the top management is responsible not only for looking at the crystal ball and determining when they can manage the risk, but they have to do it from the beginning to the end. So the risk process, it changes as a function of time as the product has been delivered. So the Tiger team itself is going to be doing, essentially 7 tasks. Maybe more, but these are the core tasks. One is they're going to identify the hazards. They're going to think about the hazardous situations, but more importantly, they're going to think about who is at risk, what harm can be done to the people that utilize it. Where are they at risk? Is it in a certain location? And when are they at risk? Is there a particular point in time during the utilization of that device where a person is more at risk than when they just open it from the package? And then more critically, they're going to determine what is the severity and the probability of harm given all of those circumstances. So there's kind of a running list, but it differs depending on where they are in the life cycle of the product. So at the very beginning, remember, they don't have a product. So that it sort of really is a little bit of a crystal ball. They have to think about what all the harms could be. But within the ISO 14971 document, there is an annex, Annex C, which basically provides a list of like 100 questions based on many different medical devices where they can go through it, and it's sort of like it's supposed to be more of like an inspiring list. You go through the list and you think, okay, does this really apply to my device? And you check off the box and you go through this list, and it kind of forces you to think about different attributes of all devices and how it applies to yours and where the risks might exist. So what I've shown on the screen here is basically, a very small component of the pre-risk analysis questions that the ISO 14971 provides as a guidance. It just shows you, roughly what the questions are. Is the medical device intended to be implanted? Yes or no? Who is it implanted in? Young kids, old kids, heavy people, young people? What are their physical activities? Is it in contact with the patient? Is it just surface contact, or is it invasive contact? So, we don't have to go through the whole list, but this gives you kind of a rough idea of how they start. They have this big list, they run through it, they come up with points. Well, now, as they build the device and it begins to roll out and they get it into clinical trials, they might actually reassess the risk using specific studies. And so here's an example of one that is focused on scalpel blades and suture needles, but you can see that the studies are very targeted and focused at trying to identify where the risk resides. So in this case, they looked at the number of cases of injuries, reported injuries, with respect to the stakeholder that used it. So who tends to injure themselves the most in using a scalpel blade? Is it the nurse? Is it the resident? Is it the surgeon? Is it the attendant? Is it the technologist? Is it the medical student? Is it someone else? So you'll do a clinical trial where you're actually going to monitor that kind of information and then use that as data to drive your risk analysis process. And so you would utilize this to say, okay, nurses are the ones that really, they get injured the most. Well, why do nurses get injured the most? And so another part of this study might be, well, first, where do they have most of those injuries? Is it in the operating room? Is it in the patient room? Is it in the procedure room? And so you can look at and try to figure out, where the injuries occur in addition to who is getting harmed. And so that will give you insight into other mechanisms that you might provide, or tools that you might add to your device, and where you might utilize them to kind of mitigate that risk. So in this case, a far majority of the injuries occur with nurses in the operating rooms. And so you could take that study a little farther. And, what is the mechanism of scalpel blade injury? So meaning, like, when they use it, or when they, when are they getting injured? Is it before they use it? Is it during its use? Is it between steps in a procedure? You have to take a scalpel blade off the handle and throw it away. Do they injure themselves when they're taking it off? Do they injure themselves if they're going to reuse it? So you can do these clinical studies to help guide the risk process so that you know where to fix some of the problems. And so you can actually come up with, you can compare risks by looking at whether or not they're severe or not. So did they cut themselves? Well, how severe was it? Was it a superficial cut? Was it a moderate cut? Was it a severe cut? So these are ways that you can not only figure out who, where, and how, but then you can also, come up with kind of concepts in terms of, well, how much harm can be, produced in that particular circumstance. So these are some of the types of studies that companies will do post hoc, or during, when they're doing clinical trials, to reassess the risk after a product has come out. So again, it's not really related to a broken part per se, but it's related to use, and it's related. It's a clear, look at the stakeholders in the context of how are they getting harmed, and in what circumstances, so that you can come up with, strategies for mitigating that risk. Now, the strategy for mitigating that risk might not even be with respect to the device that you're looking at. So here again, we've sort of seen the conclusion of that study for scalpel blades and for needles, for suture needles. And what you can see are just basically that not only did they look at who, when, where, and why, but they looked very precisely at where on the hand the injury was occurring. And so here you can see that the injury most often occurs on the forefingers as opposed to on the thumbs and on the palms. And so while that may not directly impact your ability to refine and redesign the scalpel blade itself, that may point you to develop another product which is used in conjunction with that blade that would protect these two fingers on a surgical glove perhaps better than an area of the palm, and that might be a way of mitigating the risk. Now, again, you would go through that whole process, and you would then deliver that product and see if, in fact, it did mitigate the problem that you uncovered with the later clinical trial. But that's one pretty good example of how you might utilize some of those metrics to refine the device, or even create a new device that would help mitigate problems that you would have with that original device that you designed. All right, we're at that time again in the presentation where we need to ask you a few questions. So buckle up and here we go. Question number 3. Who determines how acceptable levels of risks will be determined for each hazard and hazardous situation? Is it corporate management, the design engineer, the risk specialist, the key opinion leader or clinician, or the patient? Which of the above is it? All right, question number 4. A preliminary hazard analysis is essentially the same as a failure mode and effects analysis. True or false? Put both of your answers in chat. I'm going to take a brief pause to wait for your answers. And when we come back, we'll tell you what the results are in person. Take care. Okay, it's time to walk you through an analysis through the nitty-gritty details to show you exactly how a company goes about doing this. And in order to do that, I need to first introduce you to a product that's recently sort of been coming on the market. In 2019, a group of individuals out of Italy did a study across a population of women to look at not only their awareness of breast cancer, but how confident they were in being able to manually palpate the breast to look for lumps that were indicative of a cancerous tissue. And what they found, and this diagram here, this bar chart, actually is what drove the creation of the product. And so here you can see that after doing that population study, they found that most women were not confident in their ability to detect a lump in their breast manually, so that they couldn't really track it themselves. And so what this group set out to do was to build a device that a woman could purchase, take home, and utilize on her own to look for and help identify lumps in their breast tissue. It's a very clever device. It's shown here where they use basically a set of inflatable airbags that inflate around the breast, and they use a fabric with piezoelectric sensors that they detail in this paper that measures the forces that the breast is reacting against when the cuffs are being inflated. And so that's the new technology. They rolled this out and they started doing a risk analysis on this device. I'm going to show you parts of that risk analysis, but I think it helps to be able to know a little bit about what the technology was set out to do. And the picture here helps you think a little bit about what are the risks in using that device, because after all, you have to be able to envision how it's going to be utilized to better appreciate the risks in using it. And so that's what this team did. So in the next set of slides, I'm going to get into the details of the risk analysis that their Tiger team did in looking at what happens when a woman utilizes this device. All right, I want you to take a look at this table. The first thing that happens when you start to carry out a risk analysis is you bring the Tiger team together, and it could be a lot of different people in the room, and it's going to feel a lot like what you might think of as just a regular brainstorming session, which is focused around, how are you going to build a device? But in this case, the brainstorming session is more about what can go wrong, right? What problems can occur in utilizing this device? And so remember, the first thing that you're going to do, remember the shark and the kayak. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to try to identify all of the sharks, right? All of the hazards that could potentially cause harm to the person utilizing the device. The way that you do that is you go to the Annex E. I guess in later versions it was actually labeled Annex C. But Annex E is that list of things that you're supposed to think about in developing the device that make you kind of reflect on things that could harm the person that's utilizing the device. And they fall into some broad categories. The broad categories in this table, are the columns. The broad categories are: is energy delivered to the patient? Are there biological or chemical agents that we have to worry about? Are there operational things that the person does, human factors issues where the person has to interact with the device that could cause harm to the patient? Is there information that is provided back to the user that has to be interpreted, that could be interpreted correctly? And so once you have those broad categories, you can start to think about the problems that occur. And the main point that you should get from this is it's not just about failures of components of the device. It's not an FMEA. Of course, some of the issues on this table are related to broken parts. For example, broken wires, air inflated too low, the tubes are perforated. Yes, those are failures. But suppose the person uncovered the wires by accident. Suppose there was the presence of a chemical that was allergenic, that was in the fabric that went over the breast. Suppose the matrix, the pressure sensing matrix actually reacted with the skin. From an operational point of view, the person could put the hoses in the wrong position. It's not that the device is failing itself, but maybe they put the hoses in the wrong position and the device fails. So all of these things are really things that could go wrong in the utilization of the device, right? And so those are things that you're trying to identify. Remember, this part of the table itself is only the shark. It's only the shark. It's not going to tell you what is going to happen if the wires were broken. It's just going to say that is the shark. That is the hazard that could cause the problem. Remember, there are many scenarios related to each of the hazards that could lead to problems. In the next set of slides, we're going to take this a step beyond identifying the shark. Okay, so remember, if you remember the shark and the kayak, you'll remember that there are three things that you have to think about. Not just the shark, but the situation. Remember the tuna, the hazardous situation. And three, the potential harm that can occur in that scenario. So you'll see that this table that we first started with, which started with just the hazards, just the sharks, has now been transformed into a matrix where the first column are really just a column of sharks. They're the column of hazards, right? The uncovered wires, the uncontrolled inflation of chambers, etc., are all in the rows in column 1 under hazards. Now, for all of those hazards, you're going to have to think about what are the situations where those hazards can result in harm to the user. Now, just like the kayak and the tuna, you could have the same hazard, but the situations can be different. The shark can be just following the kayaker. The kayaker might have a tuna and the shark is really interested in the kayaker. So you could have a hazard with multiple rows that include different hazardous situations and different outcomes for harms. So you're going to create this matrix. And again, it's sort of, at this point, your best guess as to what can happen. Sometimes it's a clinician that's very familiar with the scenario, so they're kind of doing a mental walkthrough on how this device would be utilized, and they're trying to think about the different things that can happen to the patient, to the surgeon, to the tech, whomever, while that device is being utilized. But really, the first pass analysis is somewhat of a guess, and you're going to have to validate or verify, is perhaps the better word, that those risks and harms are actually problematic. Now, as back in, going back to the shark example, in those two scenarios where you had the shark without the tuna hanging off the boat and the one with the tuna hanging off the boat, if you just looked at those two scenarios side by side, the way the risk evaluation continues is that you have to come up with two somewhat qualitative components to rank those scenarios. And so there's two metrics that are commonly utilized for ranking these two scenarios. And one, it's sort of like the FMEA. One is, what is the probability of occurrence? Now, I showed you some of the statistics for a shark following a kayaker, but I didn't show you the statistics for the shark following a kayaker with a tuna. Now, those probabilities would likely be higher with the tuna than without. So that would be one metric where you would say the scenario on the right is more problematic than the scenario on the left. But then the next metric is okay, well, of those two scenarios, which one is more severe? I mean, you might have a scenario where the problem occurs 1 in 100,000 times, but when it happens, the person dies. Whereas you could have a scenario, what's the worst case scenario? It happens frequently and the person dies. So there's this mixture of two metrics. One is the probability of occurrence, and the second is how severe is the outcome. And you utilize those two metrics much like the FMEA, where you're going to multiply them together so that you can rank the scenarios to basically determine which of these outcomes are the ones that you really need to worry about. So we'll show you how that kind of plays out and how those metrics are kind of scaled in terms of the ISO standard in the next set of slides. But that is basically the gist of what's going to happen in this risk analysis. All right, so suppose you are, making a novel device and you've now assessed circumstances that you deem to be risky. How are you going to assign them, subjective scores based on the probability of occurrence or severity? And so the ISO 14971 documentation actually gives you some guidance on this. It's still somewhat subjective, but for the probability of occurrence, they suggest that you can get those statistics from either published standards, statistical references on procedures. You might have to carry out tests yourself, for ones that you think are extremely risky. You might look at the results of other investigations that are somewhat similar, but use a different technique than the one that you're employing. But more often than not, you will go based on, at least on the first pass, based on an expert assessment, meaning that you're going to solicit the response from several clinicians who are going to tell you, oh, this happens once in the blue moon, or it happens once every 10 surgeries, or whatnot. And you're going to use that to kind of guide your assessment. Now, the ISO 14971 actually provides a little bit more guidance on this, because you should be able to go from one company to another and sort of understand what, a frequent occurrence is in either company. So they provide some guidelines for probabilities. And so here's a table for the probability of occurrence, and they give kind of a verbal name for probability. So it could be frequent, would be 1 in 100, probable 1 in 1,000, less likely all the way up to improbable, meaning it happens 1 in a million times. They've given a similar type of scale for the severity of occurrence. Something that's catastrophic is something that typically results in a patient death. Critical, results in permanent impairment, or it's life-threatening. And as you move down the scale to the less severe outcome, it might be negligible, which is an inconvenience or a temporary discomfort. Now, different companies do this different ways. It's not mandated that you do it one way or another. Some companies will assign a risk, the common term, and others will give it a number, 1 through 5, as shown here on the left. But at the end of the day, what you're going to see is 3 more columns added on to that risk assessment table. And so here you see the 3 added columns. The first one is the risk number. That's a number that sort of stays with that risk, that row, for the entire lifetime of the product, so that it's traceable, so that risk number 1 is still risk number 1 10 years ago. It doesn't change. So they'll often assign a traceability number in one column, and then they'll also add two columns, one for the probability of occurrence and the severity of harm. And so here you can see each row, which is one of those risk outcomes, rated as a function of probability of occurrence and severity of harm. So now what are you going to do with those? So more often than not, you'll see that they put together a table that looks something like this, where on the y-axis you have the probability of occurrence. Here you can see frequent to improbable. And on the x-axis of this matrix, you see the severity of the occurrence going from negligible to catastrophic. Okay, so what does that tell you? So if it's frequent and catastrophic, it's going to be in the upper right quadrant of this matrix. If it's negligible and improbable, it will be in the lower left quadrant. And so what will typically happen is they will put the traceability number in the row where it matches those two particular metrics. So instead of multiplying them together, they typically will put them in a matrix that looks like this. Now they could be scaled 1 to 5, or they could be the common term, but here you can easily see which risks are more worth pursuing. So for example, you can see risk number 5 was catastrophic but improbable, whereas risk number 4 resulted in a serious problem that was a probable outcome. So this is a risk that the company might not be willing to take. So what do? So again, the management has to decide, which combinations of severity of occurrence and probability of occurrence are acceptable to the company. So they'll often take this matrix and then color it green, yellow, or red. Green meaning this is okay. Red meaning, well, this is a risk that we're not willing to tolerate. So that particular risk is something that you'll have to address and figure out how to mitigate. Sometimes there'll be a yellow, but more often than not, it's green and red. So this, in this case, is the risk matrix associated with the PALP breast device that we've been talking about earlier. And again, you can sort of see, where those risks fall. And if they're red or green, you would then translate them back to your matrix as acceptable or not acceptable. And so now you can sort of see, which ones you're going to have to, mitigate versus ones which you can sort of table for a later date. So we're going to stop here momentarily. We're at that point in the talk again where we need to ask a few questions. So we'll be right back with the questions, and then we'll move on to the final segment. Okay, once again, we're going to have two questions. I'm looking for you to put the answers in the chat window. We'll take a pause afterwards, and then we'll come back and talk about them. So the fifth question of the session is, the two measures that are used to evaluate risk are A and B. Tell me what A and B are. The sixth question is, information or data for estimating risks can be obtained from expert opinions. True or false? All right, we're almost there. We're close to the end. So now the company has decided which of these hazards can result in harm in specific hazardous situations. And they've identified risks 1 through 6 as those which are not tolerable by the company. And so they've decided that they're not acceptable risks. And so we've now completed the evaluation phase, and we've identified the risks that the company is now going to try and mitigate. And so the mitigation is basically a design change. What are you going to incorporate in order to alleviate that potential risk? It might be the use of insulated wires. It might be an appropriate case that's been designed to isolate the control board, a pressure gauge that's used to check the pressure level in the bags that are used to be inflated around the breast. And so the company will put these design changes into the process. That's the mitigation state. And once those have been completed, now we need to go around the loop again. So we'll reevaluate those particular mitigation strategies to determine if they indeed rectify the problem and reduce the risk of using this device by a user. If that's true, then those, you add another set of columns where you've gone around the loop again, and you reevaluate using the same criteria. And if indeed the mitigation strategy worked, then you would change, you would make that a yes. And so that's how this table follows the life cycle of the product. It essentially has columns that grow every time you go around the loop of the hazard analysis, and you'll continue to do this throughout the life cycle, even after the product has been on the market for several years. They may receive reports of particular failures of the device down the road that they deem are new hazards or new hazardous situations that they want to add another mitigation strategy for down the road. So again, this lives throughout the cycle of, the life cycle of the product. Okay, so we have one final question, and after that, we'll conclude with some final comments. All right, the final question is, risk management is not a life cycle process. True or false? Remember, enter your answer into the chat window. We'll briefly pause to talk about the answer. Okay, that brings us to the end of this session. So let's give you a brief recap of what we reviewed. The medical device industry utilizes a risk management plan to oversee problems that occur with its devices, not just problems that occur with parts breaking that are components of the product, but it also evaluates the risks associated with using the device or misusing the device in certain circumstances. The plan really incorporates a strategy in which you identify, evaluate risks, and mitigate the worst risks that might expose someone to harm in utilizing your product. And that process continues throughout the life cycle of that product. It's fundamentally different than some of the other tools that you may have utilized in your discipline, but the company may also implement other risk management tools like the FMEA, the FRA, the HACCP, the HAZOP, or the ETA principles for identifying additional risks. But this is, what I've described today is the overall risk management plan that a typical medical device company will employ. I hope you enjoyed this seminar. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for joining us today. Take care. Bye-bye.